Hi everyone, this is Victoria and this is a webinar hosted by the Extractive Hub and the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative. So this is a very important topic tackling local content in the extractive industries, specifically in this current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have Ms. Berry Claire, who was very essential in organizing the webinar and bringing together all the speakers. And the webinar is going to be moderated by Mr. Kester Ohibo, who is an advocate and also from the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy. So without wasting any time, I would like Mr. Kester to take over as the moderator for this webinar. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen all around the world. It's not such a sunny day here in Dundee, but it's a very fair weather as well. And this afternoon, we'll be looking at a very interesting topic that affects the extractive industry value chain. The extractive industry provides an attractive development and resource opportunity for most nations, but requires high capital and skills to develop, as we know. And so most developing countries are known to be among the largest producers and exporters of minerals and petroleum resources, while developed countries seem to be the major consumers of these resources. Hence, developing countries lack the indigenous capabilities for transforming their natural resources into commercial goods, typically defer to multinational enterprises and organizations to provide the needed capital, knowledge, manpower, and access to markets. What we see is an outsourcing of capital and skills, which can affect the opportunities for direct economic and social benefits that the extractive industry provides for a local economy. In this regard, most countries consider ways to ensure that investments in the extractive industry culminate in broad economic growth through local policies, legislations, and regulatory instruments that affect local content. Given the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown that we have seen across the globe, one thing is obvious: the supply chain, whether global or local, has been affected one way or the other. And as such, the considerations for local content policies, regulations, and instruments have taken a new dimension. Notwithstanding though, the development of these local content policies and instruments requires a good understanding of the industry supply chain and a balance of policy, legal, and industrial development elements. This also involves a continuous interaction between government institutions and organizations that directly or indirectly engage in the extractive industry. Against this background, today's webinar will be considering the subject of COVID-19 pandemic and the local content requirements in the extractive industry. We have put together a panel of distinguished experts that will provide credible insights, current trends, as well as policy and commercial recommendations on this vast issue. After a brief introduction of the panelists, each of the panel members will spend about 10 to 15 minutes to provide an in-depth presentation of specific topics that relate to the theme of our discussion this afternoon. And after the individual presentations of the panelists, we shall then take questions from the Q&A forum. And so we invite all attendees to take the opportunity to drop their questions at the Q&A section while the presentations are being made by the panelists. Also, we may likely take comments and remarks from any attendee who wishes to make them and drops them at the chat box during the course of the presentation. At the end of the discussions, I am optimistic that the clear pathways for developing local content policies and regulatory requirements post-COVID-19 would have been highlighted and substantially articulated by the panelists we'll have today. Without much ado, I will then turn over to the panelists to introduce themselves briefly before we begin to take the presentations. I would like to start with Dr. Theophilus Achapong.
Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from wherever you're joining us globally. My name is Theo Achampong. I am an economist and a political risk analyst, and I'm also a lecturer at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy at Dundee.
Thank you, Dr. Theo. Unfortunately, we received news this morning that Dr. Melba Wasuma has been called into an urgent parliamentary session and so she'll be unavailable for us this afternoon. Notwithstanding, I am confident that the rest of the panelists will do justice to the subject. And so I'll turn over to Ms. Merrill to introduce herself, please.
So hi everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which is a very important subject, like we know, especially for Africa and the developing countries. My name is Mireille Tulekima. I'm based in Perth in Australia. I'm an engineer by profession, but I'm also an entrepreneur. I'm the CEO, the founder and CEO of the MT Energy Resources based in Perth. And I've worked internationally for different companies, multinational, but also national companies. And I'm doing a lot of consulting right now, mostly on the technical side. So my knowledge of local content is more into project management and operational and really, focus on skills transfer and capability and capacity building. And I'm also an author. I wrote a book on local content called Local Content Key Enabler for Project Management in Emerging Markets.
Thank you so much, Mariel. I will now hand over to Ms. Beryl to introduce herself as well.
You are muted.
Beryl, I think you're muted. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Apologies for that. I had muted my speaker. So thank you very much, Dr. Nadule, for hosting this webinar, and Mr. Santiago, an energy lawyer with expertise on fossil fuels, renewable energy, and of course in mining. This topic is very dear to me because I'm currently completing my PhD at the University of Eastern Finland, and I'm looking at how governments particularly intervene in international businesses, and specifically looking at how the rise of local content requirement is in the extractive sectors. I am also the director of Analytic Consult, which is an advisory firm established in Djibouti, specializing in the energy emerging markets. I'm also fortunate enough to have founded and also the president of Horn of Africa Energy Industry Association, which is an organization which represents a collective voice and the interest of private organizations in and associated in the energy sector. Thank you.
Well, attendees, there you have it. We have an economist and a political risk analyst, an engineer and a management consultant, as well as a lawyer amongst our panelists this afternoon. And they have assured me that they would give in their very best in discussing the subject matter which we have put before them this afternoon. And so I kindly enjoin you to sit back, relax, get engaged, get involved, start the conversation in the chat box, keep dropping your questions, and we'll take them all at the appropriate time. And so quickly, let me defer to Dr. Theophilus, who is going to be discussing for us the subject of local content requirements and the variables amidst the current pandemic that we'll have today. He will do well also to look at why and how energy companies can and have adapted to their local content strategies, considering the effect of COVID-19. And lastly, Dr. Theophilus will try and look at how we can build better forward linkages post-COVID-19 era relating to the extractive industry. Dr. Theophilus.
Yep, thank you very much. And once again, we welcome you all to this webinar. Hopefully it will be interesting, and then we get a number of conversations going as a result. Yeah, so I'll be just trying to spend the next 7 to 10 minutes just to talk about a number of the issues that I think have arisen, but much more importantly, what we could do to sustain local content and value addition broadly post pandemic. So I hope after 7 minutes, I would have been able to provide some guidance or answers and hopefully stimulate further conversation around why and how energy companies have adapted their local content strategies in light of COVID-19, and whether actually there is even a need at all, if any, to craft any new local content requirement. And the third point around building of linkages. So I think it's important for us to kind of take a step back and to look at where we're coming from, with the pandemic that has befallen the globe. First, it is a health crisis, but I think much more importantly, it's also an economic crisis. And if you look at a number of the projections coming from the various stakeholder entities, we are entering one of the worst or difficult periods probably in our lifetimes. And the analogy has been made to the Great Depression of the 19 of late 20s and the 1930s. And this, of course, has implications for the energy industry, and specifically the oil and gas industry. As a result of COVID, we have actually seen quite a number of interventions being made by various governments and multilateral agencies. Specifically, these have actually evolved or revolved around two main broad strands, the fiscal interventions and then what I call monetary macro financial interventions. So we've seen governments across the globe trying to provide credit support policies, tax policies, either reducing VAT or corporate income tax, etc., right down to things around, direct support to SMEs. And I'll talk about that when we actually now get into local content proper vis-a-vis the extractives industry. And on the monetary financial side, we've seen both central banks globally trying to reduce their policy rate, or making bigger provisions for the non-performing NPLs loan, including things like reducing the reserve requirement. So this is just broadly what has been happening in the last 6 or so months across the globe, but it has impacted the extractives industry. And here, because I come from a bit more of an oil and gas background, I want to just characterize, the nature of the impact in the oil and gas industry. More broadly, at the national or the government level, we have seen production cuts. Some governments have announced fiscal stimulus or reduction in like the tax or the fiscal regime to stimulate more activity. But at the project level, we have seen deferment of projects. We've seen some being postponed, and as much as 120 billion or so of projects that are either been deferred or being cut. And then when you look at from the project level going down to the supply chain, we've also seen that impacting the equipment or the wider services. So for example, in the Tortue LNG project, we realized or have seen that due to COVID, the supply chain has been disrupted, and that has actually led or occasioned a delay in the project by about a year, on top of unemployment, layoffs that have happened widely in the industry. So this is the context that we're looking at in terms of local content. And the question then becomes, what do we do about it, and how do we sustain um, um, local content broadly going forward? I'm just going to skip over a couple of slides because we don't have much time, and sort of focus on what I think really is like the core and around the industrial policies that governments are using or pursuing, and then the extent to which these industrial policies are or should be linked to local content development more broadly. So on the chart you see here on the left-hand side, normally you have sort of four broad clusters of industrial policies. So countries tend to want to push around import substitution, or export-oriented growth, or resource-based industrialization, or what recently we've seen around innovation-led development. But what you would see even before the crisis is that a lot of the local content policies that have been pursued or being pushed by countries globally have what I would term not been anchored or connected to the wider industrial policy of these jurisdictions. So when you look at the drivers that are required, to drive local content, countries would pass laws, they will pass legislation, be it prescriptive or be it kind of rules based. But often we forget that there are other drivers that are needed, to push local content forward. And these drivers around the local macro environment, around borrowing, around the capability of supply chain firms, and then around even things like infrastructure access, all those things need to be addressed. And I think what COVID has offered, or what COVID does offer us really, is an opportunity to go back and rethink fundamentally to what extent these policies and laws that we often have been pursuing or pushing are connected to these wider industrial development policies. Because I think the conversation often is more clustered around at the government level. My experience is that, oh, let's pass a local content law, let's pass a local content policy. And we forget that there are other things that are actually needed to actually drive the wider development of the industry, especially when it comes to building of the forward and the horizontal linkages. So let me just spend 1 minute to give you two classic examples and my take home points. And then, of course, we can have more conversation after the other panelists have spoken. This is an example from Ghana. It's a bit dated. It's about 2017. But in this particular instance, Ghana passed a local content law back in 2013. And at that time, they were hoping within 10 years for a nascent oil and gas industry to attain 90% local content. And I mean, I was like, in all the established jurisdictions that have even produced oil and gas for over 50 years, like in Norway or in the UK, you have local content levels, however you measure it, around 60%. So it sort of beat our mind back then as to why the country was being that rigorous and wanting to push for 90% local content in less than 10 years. But fast forward to 2017-18, and what we have seen really is that a lot of the local supply chain capability is actually being developed around the green cluster. So HSC, supply chain, transportation, etc. But because the structural factors that you need to address, that developing the labor capability, developing things around infrastructure and access to capital, etc., you can see that where the bigger chunk of the pie or meat really is are in things like well drilling, fabrication, feed, and exploration. That bit, the companies in country are struggling to compete at that level. But that's where the real value really is. So I think post COVID, what a lot of the governments need to consider is to go back to the fundamentals, and the fundamentals being linking these policies to the broader based industrial development strategy that we want to pursue. So it's time to get the industrial policies right. The industry faces somewhat of a crisis, and it's not just commodities, but there's issues around energy transition and decarbonization. And I think that a new approach for the extractive industry is needed to manage the supply chain vulnerabilities, as we've seen with COVID. But it's one that needs to be done on a tripartite basis. It needs to be done collaboratively between industry and between government and between some of the other research institutions that pertain in the respective countries. And if there's anything that we can learn from COVID, or even going back to the 2008 2009 financial crisis, is that any crisis presents an opportunity. In 2008-9, we saw the localization of capital, with countries now looking more sort of inwards and trying to develop their domestic market. And I think there's an opportunity here to fundamentally rethink how we approach local content beyond just passing laws, beyond just passing policies, but addressing the structural drivers that would, inure to creating more sustainable opportunities in terms of jobs, but also in terms of local companies being able to compete globally. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teo. You've opened the space more for a much wider discussion on the issue of COVID-19 and local content. You've also done well to highlight that there are issues of linkages across the extractive value chain, and that there may be silver linings in this era of COVID-19. Without wasting much time, I would be inviting Ms. Merrill to now make her presentation.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Teo. Very nice conversation and presentation. Sorry, and I mean, as far as I'm concerned, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm more looking at local content from a project, management point of view, and also capability and capacity building. And what we've seen so far with the pandemic is that a lot of disruption in the way that things are done, and in project management, especially in terms of cost, and in terms of making sure that we have the capacity locally to be able to use the local workforce to reduce cost. And we've seen that what the pandemic has done is really highlight the issue of having a crisis plan and have contingency plans and funds to manage the level of disruption that we have with this pandemic. So, but for a lot of companies, and because I talk as an operator, for a lot of companies, this pandemic actually was about survival. And the first thing that they do when they want to survive is to lay off and make sure that they reduce cost. So the layoff is one option, and then the cancel some of the contracts or some of the projects, or delay some of the projects, like it was highlighted by Dr. Teo just right now. And it becomes really a problem for some of the countries, because as soon as you lay off, so you create a social crisis, and then you cancel all the some of the project, which means you reduce the income for the country, so the economy is obviously affected. So it creates a real problem for the local economy and for the government as well, because like as we know, in those time of disruption, especially when economic disruption, what we're trying to do, what the government normally try to do, is to keep the economy stimulated. But if there's no income coming in, because we know a lot of the countries in especially in the developing countries in Africa, they rely a lot. I mean, most of the economy rely on the resource sector, and I come from an oil and gas sector as well. So it's quite a difficult situation to be in. And obviously the local content, the way the local content is structured needs to be changed. And because it's not anymore about the long term. You have to cater for the short term, because you have all those layoffs happening, and you have all the companies basically leaving the country, and canceling most of the especially the big projects that are meant to drive the economy. So it's actually something that can be very difficult to manage. And But I think, personally, that it's an opportunity for the countries to actually capitalize on making sure that they develop a local workforce that we're going to be able to manage some of the projects, or even make sure that they are local players that can actually take over some of the operations so far. And I think by looking at it this way, it is a different type of local content, where we don't just look at international company, but focusing more on what we can do locally, and also extend it maybe regionally to see, how we can have more control on the industry, the oil and gas industry. Because if we leave it to the international company, we are exposed in a way. Yes, they participate. Yes, they bring the capital, but I think the pandemic is an opportunity for African countries, and especially the one depending so heavily on the oil and gas, to really look at how they can change, and have a new local content, local content structure, to be able to develop their local expertise. I mean, it can take several forms. It can take the form of really making sure that even if the big companies are leaving, that they actually assist any local company that's actually going to be able to take over, so that they can build up their capacity. They can have some, the technical transfer, if I can express myself like that, to bring forward the different development and manage the different projects. So I think in a way it's not all bad. Like it was mentioned by Dr. Theo, we need to look at, it's not just about, all the legal part of things. We also have to look at, on the operational side, what can we do to be able to bring more, capitalize, to have more local, local workforce and local players to participate. Because I think what this pandemic is actually doing is actually giving the opportunity for the smaller player to be able to take a chance in a market that's been heavily dominated by multinational. And I think that's a key thing that we need to focus on, and then try to put all the all the different regulation that's actually gonna allow this to happen. And which brings me to say that the collaboration aspect of local content is going to be very important. It's not going to be only about the government really, doing everything and imposing everything. It will have to be a collaboration between what's happening in the country, so the local players and some of the international players, so that they can partner with some of the local players. It's going to help them to not only reduce their cost, but also it will help, this local player to take, more responsibility in a market that was actually not accessible to them before. So, I mean, there are key things going forward that I think, companies, especially international companies, needs to really, look at. One, like I said, is to identify any, local entity that can work with them, so that they can continue to have a presence, but, at the same time, put more responsibility with, the local players, and then help as well the local content to continue, because by doing that, they continue to build, the capacity, and they also continue to transfer the knowledge in the country. And then it's actually a way to delay, this drastic action of just, not renewing contracts or not or canceling any project that they have. And I think it needs to be looked at carefully and consider, because that's really gonna be a step forward, instead of completely, giving up on local content. And the government has to play a role as well to facilitate that, because that's the key thing. Because at the end of the day, it's about, the regulators really, being the moderator in this process. And then we can, everybody can actually benefit from what's happening. So I think that's really what I wanted to add to what Dr. Theo was saying, is really looking at, as an international company, looking at, how we can involve a little bit more local entities, work with government, to really make sure that we continue to build this capacity, because we know that it's a very technical, the oil and gas and the energy sector are very technical. There's a lot of innovation going on. So it's important that, we don't just cut everything because of all the cost, to be cost effective, and then cut the whole cycle of local content that actually started in some of the country, and really building up in a way. So I think that's all I have, unless, we can continue this conversation later on at the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Muriel. And I agree with you to a very large extent that there needs to be a partnership between multinationals and the stakeholders in different countries to be able to build the required capacity that would drive local content and supply in that country, which in my view would help to drive a sustainable long-term diversified economic growth in such a country. And this takes us to a very important conversation. Having highlighted what needs to be done, the question then is, how can this be done? What should government be doing? What strategies can government adopt to actualize some of these goals we have pointed out so far? And how do we balance the objectives of governments and international business organizations as well? And this is the exact task that Beryl will be dealing with this afternoon. Beryl, please hit the tarmac.
Thank you very much, Kester. I'll just share my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay, just bear with me first. I need to, apologies for that. For some reason, I am having trouble to, perfect. All right, I couldn't agree more with the panelists who've already spoken before me. So what I'm going to do today, I'm just going to see how the possibility to strike a balance between government and international business objectives. So what I'll be looking at first is the assumptions, what motivate governments or perhaps prompt governments to regulate local content requirements in the oil and gas sectors. And then I'll be looking at what are the the pandemic, with the effects of the pandemic, which have already been talked by Dr. Theo, so I will not focus on it heavily. And then I will look at the hypothesis. And here I'll be looking at whether the government should remain in the status quo, or there's a need to have a different proposition in order for them to move forward effectively. But like every other single system of regulation, there's always a limitation. So I will be highlighting briefly what the limitations are, and then I'll provide a conclusive remarks. So the first thing that I look at is the assumption as to why there is a need to regulate local content requirements. And here I argue that it is a legal obligation to source locally goods, services, and labor. But what prompts government to do so? I argue that one of it is the dependency of natural resources, which oftentimes conflict with market forces. Traditionally, we've seen that there is a systematic mistrust between international oil companies' intentions and those of government objectives. And perhaps because of the colonial setup where we saw developing countries, developed countries take advantage of developing countries. The historical reputation has been of a predatory nature, with international oil governments pillaging natural resources and leaving nothing behind, nothing positive behind for governments to work with. In fact, in 2002, Nigeria had a report after its balance of payment and determined that there was much FDI that came into the country, but as a result, after the expatriation of investment, there was actually nothing left for governments as well as local companies to utilize from. So there was a steady push for localization policies. And in fact, in 2006, the Nigerian government introduced the local content policy, which later accumulated to the Nogisid Act of 2010. Now, we find that in the local content policies, there's always a need to either mandate this requirement or incentivize this particular requirement. Oftentimes, we find that when it's a mandate, it becomes extremely prescriptive for international oil companies. But where there is an incentive perspective, there is a sign of collaboration between the governments as well as the international oil companies. That said, we've seen the global pandemic with the health crisis, and this has led to travel bans and, of course, and international lockdowns. According to the WTO, we see that there's a potential drop of trade up to 32%. What does that mean for extractive sectors? We've seen extensively falling oil prices and production cuts. As a result, there has been huge disruption of the supply chains as well as both local as well as global supply chains. But it's not only the supply chains that have been affected. We've also seen businesses' cash flow go down, and there is a possibility that this cash flow going down is ultimately going to affect the revenue for governments. And of course, there's always an imminent financial crisis. But regardless of this effect, governments need to restabilize and come back to their commercial viability. How do they do so? And I'm arguing here is that the first thing that they need to do is inject capital to sustain an economic recovery. And not just injection of capital, there's going to be a requirement to look at supply chains efficiently in order to do so. Now, the next thing I question or I hypothesize, and I ask myself, does the current status quo, the regulatory framework, encourage the two issues that I've raised, capital injection as well as efficient supply of local and the supply chains? Or should governments introduce a new legal infrastructure in order to be able to achieve the two elements of capital injection as well as efficient supply chains? Apologies. And I argue that regardless of the system the governments choose, they need to find a system that first mitigates the challenges of the pandemic, promote the objectives and of local participation, but more importantly, maintain international investment. So the status quo right now, which I've looked at, is very much a prescriptive system. And here I've looked at both the Ghanaian one, the Nigerian, and the local content bill for the Kenyan local content. And you find that here there is a command through the law for international oil companies to mandatorily achieve local content requirements. And these mandates are oftentimes accompanied by sanctions, which are very punitive. We've seen them to be huge fines. We've seen them to be the possibility of revocation of licenses. But what governments often argue here is that the reason for them to apply this command and control system is that they need to achieve legal certainty, or what we call greater predictability of the laws. Here we find that the law is very definite, and the people who, or the subjects to whom the law would apply, would be aware of what the consequences are in the event that they fail to comply with the requirements. But the question I ask, which is heavy, is that is this particular system very much the best in terms of looking at local content? And yes, I find that to a greater extent, governments do achieve some form of local content, but at what price? Now, the first thing we find is that perhaps because of the rigidity and the lack of flexibility of these laws, they could be ignored. But the far much more compelling issue is that sometimes they're creatively complied with. And one of the creative compliance that we've seen consistently, which both Ghana and Nigeria are facing right now, is with fronting. Another particular consequence that governments are facing is the potential violation of international investment and trade laws, which doesn't accumulate very well on an intended basis, because then governments are required to reevaluate or revise their laws and adapt to new laws. And the problem with adapting new laws all the time is there's always going to be a legislative oversight with or duplication of the regulations, because each particular regulator is always given a veto power. And this veto power is always based on a mandate basis, and each particular mandate wants to achieve just their own mandate. Now, the problem with this particular status quo, as we see, is that because of its rigidity, it cannot be able to sustain and mitigate the challenges of the pandemic. And for that reason, I am proposing that we need to consider a new system of regulation. And this is what I call principle-based regulation, which is very much objective and purpose-oriented. Here, I'm arguing that perhaps governments, rather than rigidly mandate the achievement of local content, they can incentivize businesses to consider fulfilling more obligations, because with incentives, chances are that international oil companies are going to focus on achieving local content requirement. And how do we do a principle-based regulation? I said that we use the 4 S's. The first is the stringency. We look at what is the degree of the strictness imposed by the governments. I argue that if it is less strict, then the degree of fulfilling a local content requirement is significantly higher. And of course, the structure in which the regulation is applied in the sector. So it should be designed in a way that it is broad enough, that it doesn't target a specific group of people, as the case it is in many local content regulations right now. Also, I argue that it doesn't have to be as specific. It doesn't have to give the system in which an objective has to be achieved. It needs to allow businesses to find what is the most suitable way for them to achieve it, looking at their technical capability, their financial capability, of course, and their legal capability. Would that give a better outcome? I'm arguing yes, that governments will achieve not just local content regulation, but they will be able to flexibly adapt to circumstances such as the COVID-19 circumstances. Although I know that lawyers argue that the unintended consequences of principle-based regulation is a regulatory creep, because it provides a laxed environment. It is not strict, it doesn't mandate, it doesn't sanction. So the fact that it doesn't sanction, oil companies will not be forced to fulfill the obligation. But if you look at local content requirements and where we are right now with the pandemic, if you use a flexible system, the potential to just mitigate the pandemic is higher, as well as still achieve local content requirements. So with this, I also say that from the perspective of a regulator, I can understand why lawyers condemn principle-based regulation, because it doesn't give predictability, it doesn't give consistency, and therefore a regulator has the possibility to react in a given situation. They also often argue that from the perspective of the regulated, it makes it possible for businesses to get away with the slightest level of compliance. But if you look at the consequences and the unintended consequences, they are far less fatal than the status quo that we have currently. Because one, we are able to modify and improve the circumstances that we are in based on the effects of COVID-19, but we are still able to achieve the objectives of local content without having to worry the violation of other international investment, or as I mentioned in the status quo, is the fronting or the creative compliance that is usually common. So with this, I argue that in order for governments to find a balance, they need to have a flexible framework. This is looking at the fiscal as well as tax strategies to mitigate the challenges of the pandemic. But more importantly, they have to find what is the resilience of reducing legal restrictions to bring about a lasting positive system in which we can promote and maintain local participation. So what I conclude by saying is that governments need to continue incentivizing companies so that we can maintain international investments. Thank you very much.
Because I think you're on mute, so you have to unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, yes, thank you. Thank you, Beryl. I think one thing you have highlighted is that investors are very much averse to high cost environments, particularly where these are influenced by local content requirements and regulations. So the question then is, which approach do we take? A principle-based or restrictive-based legislative approach? There is a question here already, and I'd like to go straight to it. And it says, do you think that the disregard and non-compliance to the provisions of local content provisions can or should be used as a ground for the revocation of license or lease agreements or nationalization of foreign investors' assets? Beryl, I think you're most suited to deal with this.
Repeat the question again, Kester, sorry.
Do you think that the disregard or non-compliance to the provisions of local content requirements can or should be used as a ground for the revocation of licenses, lease agreements, or even nationalization of foreign investors' assets?
No, first of all, I think that we do not need to have a law. I think it's better to focus on the bidding parameters that international oil companies already put in place. If you look at the bidding parameters, you tend to find that because international oil companies want to win a contract, they will favor and apply more rules for local content. So if we go with the sanctions and if we go with the rules of regulation, we miss the point. They've already decided that we are going to have the bidding parameters. They've already declared individually that they're going to fulfill this particular requirements. So we need to focus specifically on just using the bidding parameters that international companies have already declared, and perhaps just have a system in which we can inspect the manner in which these have been applied, and we completely forget away with the sanctions that exist, because sanctions do not work very well in injecting more capital into an economy.
I think that does it really. We should focus less on sanctions and pay more attention to what incentivize our investors back into our country. Quickly, Dr. Theo, could you please respond to this question? What opportunities does the AFTA present to African countries in the oil and gas sector? And specifically, what areas could there be collaborations between these countries and between African companies, really?
Yeah, thank you. Before I get to that, I just wanted to add a little bit to the last question and support what Biral actually said. So we have seen governments go with the stick instead of the carrot in some jurisdictions, and the outcomes actually haven't really worked. And part of the reason really is that some of the fundamental structural drivers that I mentioned aren't there. So in one hand, you want the companies to meet the compliance requirement, whether it's jobs or sourcing. But if they do it as well, it increases the cost of either doing business, or they just can't find enough, of those supply chain companies or requirements in country. So necessarily they must source. So it becomes a chicken and an egg thing, and which comes first often is the subject of the debate. And I think that the sanctions regime doesn't necessarily always lead to the right outcomes. And if you specify the rules in some of the bid parameters, and you have some sort of what I'll give a middle of the road approach, where it's not exactly going with a hard stick saying, hey, you're not meeting X, Y, Z things, but let's see, okay, what are your annual local content plans? How are you meeting them? What are the challenges or the bottlenecks that you're encountering? And how can we, as the regulator, together with other government agencies, work to address those? That fosters more collaboration and improves the outcomes. The second question on the African free trade, continental free trade agreement, I think if it is implemented starting next year, it actually further opens the opportunity for more regional collaboration, because now the individual country borders wouldn't really matter so much if they address things around like the non-trade barriers, tariffs, etc. So it could very well then be that a company in Nigeria, for example, could actually utilize their supply base, shore base, etc., because of the comparative or competitive advantage that they've got domestically in Nigeria, to now provide services in Ghana or in Angola or in any of these other jurisdictions. I think the continental free trade is actually going to be one of the real game changers here post-COVID, if we really want to push. Because remember that a lot of African countries have been talking about industrialization for the last 40 years. As long as I can remember, I started studying development economics, but the outcomes have never really changed, because everyone is thinking more silo. Everybody is wanting to do more protectionist policies, etc. And with AFCTA, we have an opportunity now to move more towards regional value chains, regional linkages, and having both government and companies, trading cross border. So it's really going to be a real plus. And I think, yes, I agree that AFCTA does present or offers a big potential to further deepen or entrench, local content in the respective countries, but also at a pan-regional level.
All right, thank you, Dr. Theo. I very much agree that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement would be the game changer in the post-COVID era. Before I take questions that have already been put up, I'd like to ask Mirel a very quick one. Can you share your thoughts on what you think are the integration opportunities for local small-scale suppliers in the extractive industry, really?
Yeah, I think one of the area where you can have this integration is on the mature asset, because a lot of what's happening right now with COVID is that some of the mature assets are actually managed by international companies, and some of the terms are coming to the end, and it's not, with the current pandemic, it's not really interesting for them to stay there, and so they basically thinking about canceling contracts and just leaving. So I think that's a good opportunity for a local company to step in, even if they still have something, they still have some gaps, technical gaps, but really work on the term with the international company exiting the contract, and make sure that they can take over and have this integration, and have the government facilitate that as well. Because with what's going on, obviously the government might be looking at something that is more lucrative to solve whatever financial problem they have right now. But I think they should also facilitate and look at it as an opportunity to actually have some sustainability by giving this opportunity to those companies, and facilitating the transfer of mature assets, or transfer of technology, so that the international company doesn't just exit without leaving anything, and not supporting the company. So I think that's one area where a lot of a lot of countries can actually start to look at, okay, what are the credible local small company, or even company, that can actually position themselves and really facilitate this transfer. It might be also the national company as well, but really start to think long term, which is looking at more control of the industry by local. And again, I agree with Dr. Theo that look at the regional approach, because that's also going to be cost effective and probably more advantageous in the long term, the sustainability, so that you can run the industry from locally and regionally, and really stay away from the exposure that we now have with COVID. I mean, the industry has been really exposed, and local content is really at risk in a lot of country right now. So I think that's something to look at.
All right, thank you. So I just take a question from Loyola, and this is for Mirel again. You mentioned that highly technical nature of energy projects and the constant growing innovation. So she's looking at post-COVID-19, what impact do you think automation, mechanization, and artificial intelligence technology and the fourth industrial revolution is going to have on the local content and human capital requirements in the industry? Any predictions?
It's definitely gonna be a game changer, and we really have to look at it now. And it's not only gonna be on the operational side, and it's already happening. I mean, you have, especially offshore, you have a platform where there's a minimum amount of people operating, and everything is automated, and especially in the drilling area, and also on the management of production. A lot of things are already automated. The data are collected and analyzed by without needing a lot of people. So there's gonna be a great impact as well. So all those day-to-day tasks are really at risk. So it's really the right time as well for people involved in the industry in the different countries to look at, start to look at how this area is going to be impacted, and how they can actually position themselves to get those skills in country. And that's going to be a key thing. And you also have on the financial side of things in the industry, because it's a very capital intensive industry. And right now with COVID, it's basically difficult to get any loan or anything from banks. But then you have the fintech, which is here. And so for a lot of developing countries, it might be the right, especially if you're talking about local company taking over some of the assets or some of the operation. They will need capital. So this fintech as well can come in, things like cryptocurrency or blockchain as well. So look at how they can facilitate the to get those capital to get things going. So it's definitely going to be a game changer.
All right, I think there's also a similar question from Ahmed, and I would like all the panelists really to comment on this issue of the artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution that is very much imminent on us today, and how it affects local content requirements and regulations.
So yeah, if I can take a quick stab at that. I mean, as Mirel and Biral have all, alluded to, the point is that the industry faces, some pretty much, you could argue, existential crisis. So you've got the fourth industrial revolution and all that comes with it. You've got the issue of energy transition, decarbonization on the other hand, and then you got the age-old problem of the commodity price volatility, to deal with. And both of these combined, I think, means that we need to envision a new industry. And what I mean by that is perhaps, or maybe if I could be a little bit controversial, is do we really, at the country level, want to be pushing and talking all about this, local content, etc.? Or there's a bigger opportunity here really to use the little revenues that are coming from the resources, however small they are, to talk about wider diversification. So you don't need to then push all these as Beryl has been arguing, very restrictive stick a wooden stick approach. But the industry one is one that is very small. It wouldn't really it doesn't already employ that many people anyway. And what COVID and the fourth industrial revolution, etc., is further going to dwindle that pool, right? So the opportunity, I think, really is to use those revenues and the resources that are coming out of the revenues at the level of government to actually think about developing the wider value chain. And it's not to go using a stake. It's not going to kick multinational companies and say they should do X, Y, Z things when the other fundamental drivers that you need to be there to work hand in hand are not, are not happening, because the companies themselves naturally would want to source. My experience, they would want to source in country if the experience and the capacity or the capability is there. But often it isn't. That's why they then have to go, looking for these somewhere else.
Okay, Beryl, I'd like to get your take on this, particularly seeing that both Muriel and Dr. Theo have proposed that rather than countries to go about looking for how to adjust laws that would now create a sort of a competition and requirement for companies to abandon AIs and focus on human local skills, they should rather look for a more collaborative approach. So what do you think really countries should be doing in view of the imminent fourth industrial revolution?
Yes, for me, I think that first, we've determined that, like any other industrialization, law has played a significant role in bringing about industrialization, but laws need to reduce more from the protectionism element that they are, because we've seen even other industrialization, the more protectionist you are, the less you're able to attract investment. So the first thing is, rather than focus on protecting your sector, you already have a bidding parameter that you've requested these people to utilize. Use the bidding parameters to ensure that each particular international organization is able to achieve significant amount of local content requirements, looking at the financial capacity, the legal capacity, of course, and the technical capacity. If you introduce laws all the time, you will be forced consistently to review these laws. And we've seen that in Nigeria and of course, Ghana, when they have to consistently mitigate policy issues that arise. And policy issues will arrive regardless of how perfect a law is. But if you do have a system in which is flexible enough to navigate the environment, then you won't have to worry about consistent revision of laws that actually do not add value to any legal methodology.
All right, before I come back to you, Beryl, I think Dennis has asked a question which I believe Muriel has attempted to answer or has actually answered, which is on the role financial institutions can play to grow domestic supply chains across Africa. Perhaps, Muriel, you might want to just throw more highlights on that. So Dennis is asking, what can financial institutions play and do to grow domestic local supply chains across the continent?
And I think the domestic financial capacity is actually a problem in the resource sector. I mean, we don't. I mean, the banking system, the financial institution are actually quite weak, and I think that's why we always rely a lot on international players to come in, because what's happening is that, you know, the local player, because there's no very strong financial institution, they can't actually, like I said, because it's a very, you know, high capital, you need high capital to really, you know, operate in the extractive sector. So you will have to, you know, to go to ask for more capital to help you to operate, or to if you have to do exploration, or if you have to do mining. And if those institutions are not available in the country or in the region, it becomes very difficult for you to actually participate in the industry. And that's why, you know, you will have to rely on external players, international players who have access in their countries to those financial institutions and to those foreign capital. So I think that it's actually, it's not just, you know, an extractive industry problem. It's actually a country problem where, you know, we need to see, okay, if we want local players to have you know, an increasing role in the industry, we have to work with the financial institution as well and the government to create some stable institution where the company could go and, you know, have loans to start, you know, operating, or even to be involved in exploration, which is the high capital side of the industry if you talk about oil and gas. So it's really, like I said, it's a full collaboration, and sometimes that's the problem of, you know, so some of our government, they look at local content only on the legal side, but it's actually an integrated effort that you have to look at. Yes, there's a legal side, but you also have to look at, you know, the social, the financial capacity that you have. How can you grow that to allow, you know, this industry to be able to be a key element of the supply chain and the sustainability of the economy.
All right. Thank you so much, Muriel.
A quick one to that.
Okay, please.
Yes. No, on the financing, two really quick issues. What I have seen work, and which I so can probably be a model post-COVID, is the local financial services or industries could actually adjoin the joint pooling model, right? So in every country, you have a number of banks in there, but I don't see any reason why it should just be one bank wanting to finance a particular development. In fact, you could pool all the resources together, and then everybody takes a certain of portion of that, of that resource. So let's say they want to raise 1 billion for a failed development, that could easily spread the risk in terms of the portfolio by having different, financial institutions taking a little portion of that. An example that has worked, I think, in the Ghanaian context was something to do with insurance placement. So hitherto, the insurance for a lot of the assets offshore was being placed outside of the country, but the insurance companies came together and then they put all their resources together, and that then made ensure that the underwriting of those policies and assets could be done domestically in country, and that's something that could be done. Secondly, I think the issue around local content funds. So in a lot of the laws, you would see that there's mention of a local content development fund or something like that in there. This is an avenue where government could, walk the talk by not just asking money from the industry per se, but also contribute into those funds. But much more importantly, how those funds then are used, to support it. So I would want to see things around like, government or these funds giving out grants for specific research that are tied to innovation, things that can actually then help or generate a wider ecosystem with a multiplier effect, and not just dishing it out, sometimes again, even to political cronies. So those are the two suggestions I would make there.
Before proceeding, I must apologize that we have overrun our time so far, but you'd agree with me that it's an interesting conversation we are having. And if I have your consent, we'll just quickly take the questions we have so far and then wrap off on that note. So quickly, Beryl, Goswell is asking with relation to goal setting approach or performance-based approaches, if this could be adopted also, having a look at how it's been used in terms of the health and safety issues in the industry. Do you consider the performance-based approach something that can be adopted on a wider scale, taking a cue from how it's been utilized in terms of health and safety issues in the industry? And he referenced the case in the UK oil and gas industry, as well as the Norwegian oil and gas industry.
Indeed. So I agree with you that the health and safety has considered the use of performance-based, and not just the health and safety industry, also the Financial Services Authority, both of Canada and UK. And in fact, the Norwegian local content was formulated and brought about by principle-based regulation, which is performance-based. The Norwegian has a specific law which governed or determined how local content could be achieved. What it did have is contractual framework in which, or what we call training, which international oil companies would train local Norwegians in order to ensure that local Norwegians have the expertise that is necessary. So yes, I agree with the Norwegian system in which you do not have to have a specific law, because as I pointed out, that if you do have a specific law, you will have to focus on policy issues that arise, and that means you have to revise, adapt a new law. And every single time you do that, we have regulatory duplication. So I agree with perhaps considering what the Norwegian system did, and we go the contractual way rather than have a regulation that is very stringent and very limiting in achieving local content requirements. I hope I did answer the question.
Fantastic, you did. Dr. Theo, someone from Ghana, Clement actually from Ghana, agrees suggests that you would agree with him that in order to satisfy local content laws, some foreign entities tend to include in their management structure local staff, but then they don't actually make any meaningful decisions. And that at times too, some local companies tend to front for these foreign entities, in essence, compromising the requirements. So he's asking, how can the Petroleum Commission ensure local companies put a stop to these acts? And do we need strict compliance back to the evaluation and monitoring teams going after this organization? Well, I would like to see if Theo would disagree or agree with Beryl on this subject.
No, I agree with Beryl. I think she spoke at length to it, because the very reason why companies are fronting or wanting to, or doing some of these things is to do with how the law has been framed and the overly prescriptive nature of the law itself. So, it's a question of cause and effect, or which one comes first in terms of, dealing with it. So if one were to go back just a couple of years ago when the Ghana law or even the Nigerian law was being passed, some of these issues were raised back then, that if you try to strictly enforce, you're going to see problems like this manifest down the line, because then it just becomes a box ticking exercise, and people just have companies and they claim to have a local partner on the ground, but it's just on paper. The work is actually not done by them. But it's a manifestation of a problem, I think, with the law. The problem is, or the challenge is, that the law is already here. So as Clement is saying, what do we now do about it, especially in a post-COVID world? Yes. I think one of the maybe solutions around that is to go back to the drawing board. I certainly don't think it's a question of going to chase after these companies. And in any case, the laws also provide for the companies to file all these annual paperwork, etc. So that could be an avenue then to review and say, okay, well, you claimed you're going to do XYZ as part of your annual local content plan. How have you met it? How are you training people? How are you retaining value in country, rather than just a question of who is fronting, for one company or the other. I think there are more substantive, issues that need to be addressed, because the fronting only is a symptom or a sign of a wider problem, i.e. the very prescriptive nature of the laws.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I said I fully agree. I think one of the gap that we often see is really how do the government monitor those, what's happening, because we have fantastic, regulation law, but how do we monitor, how we monitor how the value is added? And that's a key one to really, focus on, because otherwise it's good to have all of this, but we really don't add value to the country, and local content doesn't really have any effect at all. So it's important to also set, to have clear targets and have clear monitoring metrics, and really, have, the clarity in that, so that, when you collaborate with the or when you deal with international company, things are really clear, and you can easily, facilitate the engagement and bring this this value in country.
And just to add on to what you've said.
Thank you so much.
Apologies, Kester. If you just look at the Kenyan Local Content Bill, it highlights the issue of fronting, and it goes ahead to just say that they determine fronting as an offense. Therefore, if you are a person who participates in fronting or connives to participate in fronting, you will have a fine of up to 5 million Kenyan shillings, which goes ahead just to emphasize on the command and control system. So these particular companies will find perhaps creative ways to comply rather than actual comply with the regulation. So I completely do not agree with the idea that laws have to be as stringent as they are, because they just make it much more difficult for companies to achieve local content, and therefore they will look for ways to creatively comply.
Okay, we're back to this issue of after again, and I'd just like Dr. Tio to answer this for Mr. Macri on oh, I think it's taking off. Let me just get it. Yeah, Macri is asking if the after is inherently meant to diffuse local content within Africa, because the idea of after is to reduce emphasis on borders and nationality. I think you have spoken about this earlier on, but if you just have anything to add, and then we'll take the last question.
Yeah, no, I definitely spoke about it earlier, but the key point
Okay.
is that with after they're not going to be national borders, right? So in some sense, we're giving away part of the national sovereignty, as the lawyers would argue, to a supra, body. And this goes back to, if you go back into history, the foundation of the OAU, Organization for African Unity, and then now AU, all of that. If we understand that country borders don't really necessarily mean much, and we are thinking about a continental approach to doing things, then definitely with after the local content or conceptualization of local content is not just what happens at the country level, because the borders have been diffused. It's not going to be what happens at a continental or even regional level.
But just to follow up on this, what specific linkages can you identify that we need to look out in Africa, either the backward linkages or the forward linkages? Where really should we begin to tighten our plug on in Africa?
So I think we've seen a number, if you look at the data or the evidence, especially in the upstream side, at least there's some evidence that backward linkages are there and they do exist. And there are companies that are, working in the supply chain, etc. The real challenge has been the development of the forward linkages. And it goes back to the industrial policies or the industrial strategy of what these countries want to do. And I think the biggest opportunity I see for Africa or the continent really is with gas, because that didn't really come up in a lot of the conversations. But gas does offer an opportunity in terms of the decarbonization of the energy mix, but also get a lot of people on the continent now connected in improving energy access. 600 million people don't have access to any form of clean energy or electricity on the continent, and that's a big problem that needs to be addressed. So with gas, we can now think about building part of those forward linkages. So that's in terms of refineries, what we've seen with Dangote doing in Nigeria, what in Equatorial Guinea they're talking about now on building like a mega gas hub to trade LNG. In East Africa, we've seen Tanzania and Mozambique also talking about developing a regional gas value chain that allows them to move those products to Zambia and then to South Africa, and then also, of course, in other parts of West Africa, Ghana, Senegal, Mauritania. So you could see elements of that beginning to pick up. And this is where I think really both government and industry can actually work to push or advance, that agenda on building forward linkages, especially around the gas industry.
But just to ask, Beryl, taking a cue from what Theo has said, do you think governments across Africa are determined or are considering a better option or a different option of, rather than focusing on the physical linkages of gaining revenue from these resources, to a production or a consumption linkage at this time?
Just to touch up on the African free trade, let's just look a little bit about the Norwegian, and in particularly 1994, where the Norwegian had to revise its law and had to move away from protectionism, from offering international oil companies, or rather denying international oil companies and focusing on Norwegian companies. So if we are going to go the AFT way, we have to do away with local content requirements individually per country, because from a competitive level, you cannot claim on one hand free movement of goods or free movement of people, and on one hand insist that only a particular people who have access to the resources of a particular extractive sector. So I think that if we have to go the African free to direct way, we have to follow the Norwegian system of completely doing away with local content requirements and focusing heavily on a competitive level per country and not local content.
All right. Finally, Mirel, this is a very direct question from Daryl saying, is there evidence of regulators driving operator realignment of local content strategy in line with national interests due to COVID? Or is it something that should be left to operators to adjust their strategy, which in the case of IOCs may not be the most beneficial for the country? Finally.
Say again, I missed some of the...
Okay, so Daryl is wanting to know if there is evidence of regulators driving operator realignment for local content strategy in line with national interests due to COVID, or is this something that should be left to operators to adjust their strategy as they think fit?
I think as an operator, you want to adjust because at the end of the day, you're looking at a balance between still being competitive but also fulfilling the local content requirement. And that's I think that's the way you look at it, because if you leave it to the country to set it, at least collaborate with them to set what is the right balance for you as a company, and what value you can bring up to still being competitive in a way, because obviously you're not there for charity, so you have to make sure that also business wise you win something. And I think that's, and I just think that it's a collaboration effort. And obviously, as a company, you always want to negotiate and get the best deal, but it has to be a collaboration effort. Nobody can come and impose, especially with COVID. Companies, we need businesses, and we will align to a point where we know that, okay, there's a breakthrough, and for local government and all the regulators, I think they need to also look at how they can accommodate that, so that they can continue to still have investment coming in the country.
All right. Final words, Dr. Theo, please, quickly.
I think, yes, definitely there's an opportunity here for us to fundamentally rethink what local content is and what local content means. The industry is changing. It faces the issues we've talked about, price volatility, fourth industrial revolution, energy transition, and these have implications for the conceptualization or the approach for local content. And there is then a need to move away, I think, and I agree with Beryl, some of these hardcore prescriptive-based approaches, because the evidence shows that they don't always work, to one in which you're talking more goal setting, and in which you have more closer engagement and collaboration between the different stakeholders.
All right, Beryl, final words.
I keep forgetting that I'm on mute. Yes, right. I think flexibility is the key. We need to evaluate our fiscal and tax strategies in order to mitigate the pandemic challenges. We need to remain resilient. Therefore, we have to reduce legal restrictions and bring about a lasting positive nature for promoting local participation. But more importantly, I think governments need to focus on incentivizing companies so that we are able to maintain international investments. If we don't go this direction, then unfortunately we will be in a vicious circle as we've always been, and we'll never achieve local participation. We will not be able to mitigate the pandemic challenges, and definitely we will not be able to encourage and maintain international investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirel. Final words, please.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, there's a need to create a new era of local content practices, in this age of COVID-19. it's not about, you know, imposing anymore. It's more about, you know, engaging. So make sure that we have the right, you know, rule of engagement, and make sure that we collaborate and find, you know, a winning point for everybody, and really create for governments, create, you know, the environment to still have those companies coming and bringing value to the country, and which means as well, make sure that, you know, the operators or investors coming are actually, you know, putting an effort to develop as well, you know, the local capacity and capability, because that's what's going to be sustainable in the long run. So definitely a lot more collaboration, less, you know, stringent regulations, and understand that it is a competitive world. I mean, it is a contest. So you have to bring the right, you know, the right things on the table to make sure that, you know, companies continue to come. And if they, you know, if they're making profit, they're going to come. It's just a matter of really, you know, creating the environment to have a clarity on what the countries really need, and how, you know, company can feed in when they come and do business on in country.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, ladies. It's been an interesting time having this conversation on COVID-19 and local content requirements in the extractive industry. We have been able to highlight that this is an important subject that we should be having research about, we should be talking about, and countries should be looking at ways to modify and realign post-COVID-19. We've also been able to understand that more collaboration is required between governments and industry players and other stakeholders as well. And so this is one opportunity I see, and there is a silver lining indeed for the stakeholders to come to the roundtable and begin to talk about this very important issue. One point we have also noted is that particularly in the African continent, in the era of AFTA, there is need for countries to begin to take advantage of what that trade agreement provides for the continent. On a final note, we have been able to take questions, and I believe the conversation will need to continue beyond this forum. And so I'd like to encourage the attendees, while thanking you for your time this afternoon, to look out for more of these issues and discussions on the Extractive Hub website, as well as the African Extractive and Mining Industry Initiative. It's been a wonderful time speaking with you, Dr. Theo, Mirel, and Beryl. And thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Thank you so much, attendees. Good afternoon.
Yep, you're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dr.